We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Gimel Amud Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 43b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing a carbon mincha that became pigul, and Ula made a statement with regards to that carbon mincha. He said the kometz of that carbon mincha, if it's offered on the mizbeach, if it's burned on the mizbeach, so then the pigul goes away from the kometz. And the Gemara was discussing what exactly is Ula teaching us. In general, we know even from our Mishnah that the pigul really takes effect on the remainder of the carbon mincha. It doesn't take effect on the kometz, because the whole idea is that it takes effect on what was permitted, not on the permitter, and the kometz is the permitter of the carbon mincha, it is the matir. And so the Gemara eventually said that what Ula was teaching is that, let's say this kometz goes on the mizbeach, so then moshlab ha'or, if the fire takes control of it, so then we say even if it comes off the mizbeach, even if it's yerdu, it comes down from the mizbeach, you have to bring it back up onto the mizbeach since it was already on the mizbeach and the fire took control of it. But the Gemara said, Ula already said that one time, why would he need to teach us the same idea twice? And the Gemara now continues and says, one might have thought if Ula only said it once, that that's only true by Aver, that would be true by a limb that's being burned on the Mizbeach, the Mechaber, because there it's all attached to itself, it's all one unit. Rashi explains, Aver the Mechaber, Ikalaman de Amar, there we would say, Kevan de Moshla ha'or b'miksaso, since the fire took control of part of it, Niklat kulo b'kedusha, it all has that kedusha, and if it comes down from the Mizbeach, it has to go back up upon the Mizbeach. But the Gemara continues, Aval Kometz, but with regards to the Kometz, the Mifras, where it's separate units, so Eimalo, so one might say no, that we don't say over there that it goes back upon the Mizbeach, Kamash Malon, and that's what Ula teaches by teaching it a second time. There also, if Moshla Ha'or, if the fire took control of it, so then it does go back upon the Mizbeach. And Rashi explains, Aval Kometz de Mifras Eima b'mai de Moshla mi Kometz Shala. One might say by a Kometz which is really separate, and so therefore the area of the Kometz which the fire took control of, so that goes back on the Mizbeach. But Idach Kedekai Kai, but the rest of it should just be as is. It doesn't go back on the Mizbeach. Kamash Malon, and so Ula's teaching even over there, the Kule Kechad Ever Dami, it's there similar also as if it was one limb, and therefore it does go back upon the Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Achoy says, Hilkach, therefore, Haikometz pigul de palge moches ha'aro, palge aske amarocha. Let's say you have a kometz of pigul, and half of it is on the ground, and half of it is on the maroches by the fire of the Mizbeach, umoshlabo ha'or, and the fire took control of it. Hilkach, therefore, means to say, since it's all considered one unit, so masikna le lekule lechatchila, so lechatchila, you're going to bring all of it now up on the Mizbeach. Rashi explains, Hilkach, therefore, Kevan de Mechasheves le Mechuber, since you're considering it all attached, it's one unit, Afilu lo haleu alachetzu, even if you only brought up half of it onto the Mizbeach, Umashla bo ha'or, and the fire took control, Niklat avzesh ala karka umala, so then even the part that's on the ground, it's going to also have that kedusha, and you'll bring it up onto the Mizbeach. And Rashi continues and explains, the hakiyaske lekule nami, because even when you're bringing it all up on the Mizbeach, lo haya lo lahalo, so he doesn't bring it back upon the Mizbeach im yered if it came down from the Mizbeach, ela mishum ahushem moshla ha'or, only because of the part of it which the fire took control of. V'ko'amrit im yered hashar yal, and we said again that if it does come down from the Mizbeach, everything goes back up on the Mizbeach. Alma ahani lekula, you see that once the fire takes control of it, even though it's only part of it, it helps for the whole thing. V'afagav de mifras, even though it's separate. Hilkach, therefore, loshna ala kulo v'loshna lo ala el miksaso. The same would be true. It wouldn't make a difference if the whole thing went up on the Mizbeach at first, or even, let's say, only part of it went up on the Mizbeach, and again, the fire took control. The rest of it then would be brought up upon the Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues with the two dots. Amar Rav Yitzchak, Amar Rav Yochanan. Rav Yitzchak says that Rav Yochanan says, "Hapigul v'hanosar v'hatame." If you have pigul or nosar is an offering that's left past the proper time, or tame, let's say the offering became impure. Shehelon legavi mizbeach. Let's say they were brought up upon the mizbeach. Paka isra mehen. So then the isra leaves them. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Chisda says, Mori Dichi, the teacher of this, meaning the teacher of this halacha, Mizbeach mikvah tahara, is the Mizbeach like a mikvah that purifies? How does this make sense? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rabbi Zeira says, Shemoshla bohen ha'or. We're talking about a situation again where the fire took control. Once the fire took control, it's as if it belongs to the Mizbeach, and therefore it stays on the Mizbeach. Rashi explains, Paka Isur and Mehen, the Isser leaves, Isser Pigel L'chida Amran Shem Yered Yalev, when it comes to Isser Pigel. So again, as we said, that if it comes down from the Mizbeach, so it has to be brought back up. V'Isser Noser V'Tamei Nami, and also when it comes to the prohibition of Noser and Tamei, L'hachi Paka, means to say that the Isser leaves, Shelo Yischayev Ha'ochlo Midi, that if the person eats it, he's not going to be chayev at all. Mari Dichi, so then he said, Baal Hashmua Hazos, the teacher of this halacha, Mizbeach Mikvah Taharu, is the Mizbeach like a mikvah that purifies, Letaris Atuma Mishum Dalu, just because you brought it up on the Mizbeach, that purifies it from the Tumah. And again, the Gemara answered that we're talking about a situation where Moshla Bohen Or, once the fire takes control, it's as if it belongs to the Mizbeach. And the Gemara continues, Mesev Rav Yitzchak Bar Bisna, Rav Yitzchak Bar Bisna asks a question on this from the following Brisa. The Brisa says, Acherim Omrim, others say, V'tumaso Olav. It says in the Pasuk that the Tumah is upon him, or the Tumah is upon it. We'll see Rashi in a moment. We learn from there, Misha Tumah Porachas Mimenu. We're talking about something where the Tumah can theoretically leave. That's what we learn from the Pasuk. The whole question over here is whether the Pasuk is talking about the Tumah on the person, or is it talking about the Tumah on the meat of the carbon itself? And we understand that Tumaso Olav means it has to be something where the Tumah in theory can go away, and that's not true by the meat. Yotza Basar Shein Tumah Porachas Mimenu. This excludes meat where the Tumah doesn't go away from it, it doesn't flee from it, meaning to say by a person is able to purify himself, and it has to be a situation where purification is possible. That's the context of the pasuk, and that's why the Acherim say we must be talking about Tumas Haguf. We're talking about when the person is Tameh. And so the Gemara now asks its question. Via Misa, now if it's true what we said above, meaning we said above that if you have an offering, you have a carbon that's held on the Gabi Mizbeach, that was offered on the Mizbeach, and Paka Isser Mehen, that the Isser goes away, and again we said Shemashla Behen Or, the case over there is when the fire rules over it, but then Harei Tumah Porachas Mimenu, isn't there a way of getting the Tumah off of the meat? Al Yedei Ha'or, through the fire, as we just said above. It seems like there's no way of getting the Tumah off of the meat. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rava says, Al Yedei Mikvah Ka'amrina. No, we're talking over here of purification through a mikvah specifically, so that wouldn't count. The fact that the fire of the Mizbeach can purify would not count. But the Gemara asks, Midi Mikvah Ksiv, does it say, is it written anywhere here anything about mikvah? That's not true. So El Amar Papa, rather a Papa says, B'visar Shlomim Askinon. Here, we're talking specifically about the meat of a carbon shlomim, the lo chazil hakrav, which is not supposed to be offered on the Mizbeach. When we said that the Mizbeach can be mitaher, so to speak, that's by something that's supposed to be offered on the Mizbeach, a part of the carbon that's supposed to be burned on the Mizbeach, but by the meat of a carbon shlomim, which is not supposed to be offered on the Mizbeach, so that would actually not be purified by the Mizbeach, and so therefore, again, the Acherim understand it's clear we're talking about Tumas Haguf when the person is Tameh. The Gemara continues with another answer. Ravina Amar Ravina says, V'tumaso Olav, it says again that the Tumah is upon him. Mi shetuma porachas mimenu kishu shalem. The Acherim understand that to mean that the Tumah goes away from the person when he is whole. Yotza Basar, that would exclude meat. Davar she'ein Tumah porachas kishu shalem. There's no way of removing the Tumah and keeping the item intact, keeping it whole, ela kishu chaser, because the only way to remove the Tumah is to burn it on the Mizbeach, which means that it would then be lacking, it would not be whole anymore, and that's how they understand, that's how they know that the meaning of the pasuk is talking about Tumas Haguf when the person is Tameh. Before we see Rashi, we'll take a look at the full pasuk. The full pasuk is V'hanefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlamim. It says clearly in the pasuk the person is eating the meat from a carbon shlamim, as the Gemara just mentioned over here. We're talking about a carbon shlamim. Asher la'Hashem v'tumaso olav, and there is tumah. And again, the discussion over here is what's tameh? Is the person tameh, or is the meat of the carbon tameh? And at the end of the pasuk is v'nichras hanefesh ahim me'ameh, that the punishment for that is kares. And Rashi explains, V'tumaso olav l'kamon ma'isinon l'vishmaitin l'meimra, the v'tumas haguf medaber. We're going to say again that we're talking here when the person is tameh. V'yahai krakoi v'anefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlamim asher l'Hashem. Again, that's a quote of the pasuk we just saw. V'tumaso olav yachol tumas basar. Now one might think the pasuk is talking about the meat being tameh. The name of the high olav basar koi. The word olav might be talking about the meat. The name, and then we would say the tar shachal as a tameh chayiv. If a pure person eats this carbon, the meat of the carbon that's tameh, tumah, he'd be chayiv kares. That's not what we're talking about. Talmud Lomer, the pasuk says v'tumaso olav. It says v'tumaso olav. Mashma sha'adayin he olav b'yacholin litoyer hakosim medaber. That implies that we're talking about the type of tumah that the person is able to purify himself from, and that has to be tumah on the person. V'zeu haguf, that has to be the body. Shetuma porachas mimenu al yedei tefillah, because by immersing you can remove that tumah. Now the question of the Gemara was v'yamisa. Now if it's true that the mizbeach can purify when the fire takes control of it, so if that's true, v'yamisa dev'sar kodshim yachol litar al yedei mizbeach. If it's true that the meat of a carbon can become pure through the mizbeach, mehecha yalfi acherim. So how do the acherim learn the lo b'basar mishtayikra? How do they know that the pasuk is not talking about meat? Harei tumah parachas mimenu. There also the tumah can be taken away, can go away. And the Gemara answered, the first answer was, B'bisar shlamim askinon. We're talking about the meat of a carbon shlamim, dekra b'shlamim ksiv, because the pasuk is clearly written about a shlamim, de'eino roy lemizbeach. Now the meat of a carbon shlamim is not supposed to be offered on the mizbeach, ve'ein mafriach mitumaso, and therefore the mizbeach is not able to remove that tumah. Ravina said a different answer. Again, it has to be that the tumah goes away when the item is shalem, or when the person is shalem. So according to Ravina, af evarin, even the evarim, even the limbs, some have the girsa here of a murim, even the sacrificial portions, haru'uyin lemizbeach, which are fit for the mizbeach, ksivi hacha, even if that is what was written over here, techsiv asher la'Hashem l'rabos ha'murim, it says asher la'Hashem, and that includes the murim, ve'afilu hachi lo tiksha, even if that were the case, it's not difficult. The shaper yafina minei de tumah lava layokai, still we can understand clearly that we're not talking about the tumah upon them. Midechsiv tumaso olav demashma beroy lafrech tumaso kishu shalim, because the tumaso olav doesn't just mean that the tumah can be removed, it means again that the tumah can be removed when the item, or in this case the person, is intact. Ke'ein shekibla olav is still in the same state as when the tumah was received. Be'enei, again, it's in front of us, in front of our eyes. Mashma, that's how the pasuk should be understood, and that's how again the acherim know that we're talking about tumas haguf. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Gufa, returning to what we just said above, V'tumaso olav, again the pasuk says V'tumaso olav, V'tumas haguf hakosim medaber, the pasuk is talking about when the person is tamei, Ata omer V'tumas haguf, now you say that the pasuk is talking about when the person is tamei, Oeino ela V'tumas basar, maybe it's actually talking about when the meat is tamei, Nemar kan tumaso, it says over here the word tumaso, V'nemar lahalan tumaso, and it says further on the word tumaso, it says tumaso bo, so ma lahalan V'tumas haguf hakosim medaber, just like the context of that pasuk is talking about when the body is tummy, when the person is tummy. Afkan b'tumas haguf hakosim medaber. So too over here, we're talking about tumas haguf. And Rashi explains, "B'tumas haguf hakosim medaber." Again, we're talking about tumas haguf. Sharei osek ba v'holech, because really that is the context in general of these psukim. T'chsiv, because it's written called tahor yochal basar, talks about a pure person eating the meat, clearly talking about the person. V'samach leiv hanefesh asher tochal basar, and then comes this pasuk about someone who eats the basar, again talking about tumah. Afal pi shehischil lahazkir haguf b'lashon nekeva. Now Rashi notes, even though shehischil lahazkir haguf b'lashon nekeva, originally the person is mentioned in the feminine. V'hanefesh asher tochal, it says tochal in the feminine. Uchsiv tumaso olav, and then the pasuk switches to olav lashon zachar, which is masculine. The mashma dekoya basar, that would already imply that we're talking about the meat, but still betumas haguf diber v'lo betumas basar. Still, we're talking about tumas haguf, not tumas basar. Oh, wait, no, ela betumas basar. Maybe you'll say it is tumas basar to olav lashon zachar, because again, as Rashi just said, olav is masculine. That would indicate the basar. V'yochel huzkor b'lashon nekeva, and the one eating, and that's mentioned in the feminine. Hachi garsin, and the proper text should be as follows: Tumaso l'gzer shav. Again, it says tumaso here. It says tumaso further on. V'yolef mi bias mikdash t'chsiv be'od tumaso bo. We're learning this out from entering the mikdash, that it's written over there od tumaso bo, talking about tumas haguf. So we know that we're talking about tumas haguf. And the Brisa continues, Rabbi Yossi says, Hoel v'nemru kodshim b'lashon rabim, since kodshim is said b'lashon rabim in the plural, v'nemra tumah b'lashon yachid, and tumah is stated b'lashon yachid in singular, so therefore it's clear, b'tumas haguf hakosim medaber, that's how we know that we're talking about tumas haguf. And Rashi explains, Hoel v'nemru kodshim b'lashon rabim, shlomim lashon rabim him. The word shlomim is a lashon rabim. That's plural. V'tumah b'lashon yachid, and the tumah is written in singular. D'chsiv v'tumaso olav. When it says v'tumaso olav, that's clearly singular. V'lo ksiv v'tumasam aleihim. It doesn't say v'tumasam aleihim, which would be the plural. So that's how we know that we're talking about tumas haguf. And the Brisa continues, Rebbe Omer, Rebbe says, V'ochal b'tumas haguf hakosim medaber. When it says V'ochal, we're talking about b'tumas haguf, again, that the person is tamei. Taking a look at the full pasuk, V'nefesh kisiga b'chol tamei b'tumas adam o b'vehema tmeya o b'chol sheketz tamei v'ochal mibsar zevach hashlamim. So it talks there about a person who is tamei, kisiga b'chol tamei, etc. And then it says v'ochal, that he eats mibsar zevach hashlamim asher l'Hashem. And again, v'nichor so hanefesh hahi me'ameh, it says that there is going to be kares, and that's the very next pasuk of the pasuk we're discussing. And so therefore Rebbe says, from that we can understand that we're talking about tumas haguf. Rashi explains, Rebbe Omer v'ochal b'tumas haguf hakosim medaber mikra shali acharav yochiach al zeh. Rebbe is essentially saying that the next pasuk proves this. T'chsib b'asrei nefesh kisiga b'chol tamei v'ochal mibsar zevach hashlamim. So clearly that's tumas haguf. Well, l'kamei meforish. Now later on the Gemara will explain hechi mashma le'mi v'ochal dekra basra hochacha al rishon. How do you see from the v'ochal of the later pasuk what the first pasuk is talking about? Shebetumas haguf hakosim medaber. How does that show that the first pasuk is talking about tumas haguf? And finally, the Brisa continues, Acherim Omrim, others say, V'tumaso olav, it says V'tumaso olav, and this is the same Acherim we just quoted above, Misha Tuma Porachas Mimenu, again it means somebody where the Tuma can be removed, again through going to a mikvah, purification, Yotza Basar, that excludes the meat, She'ein Tuma Porachas Mimenu, there the Tuma does not go away. And Rashi explains, V'tumaso olav, mashma, it's understood, Sha'adayin lo niter mimenu. It sounds like the pasuk is saying that yet he still has not purified himself. But that implies, B'misha tumaso porachas mimenu hakosim medaber. That implies that at least we're talking about something or someone where the tuma could go away through purification. Again, that's why it's clear we're talking about a person, tumas haguf. Di'iba b'asr liolam hu olav, because if we're talking about meat, the meat is always tummy, there's no way to remove that tuma. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar, the master said, quoting from the Brisa above, Rebbe Omer, Rebbe says, V'ochal, the subsequent pasuk says the word V'ochal, he ate, but tumas haguf hakosim medaber. That indicates that we're talking again about tumas haguf, we're talking about when the person is tamei. And the Gemara says, my mashma, how is it that we can understand from this later pasuk that earlier pasuk is talking about tumas haguf? And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Rava says, Kol krodulo meforish lei Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi, any pasuk that's not explained by Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi, v'chol masnisa delo meforish lo Rav Zeiri, and any brisa that's not explained by Zeiri, by Rav Zeiri, lo mifresha, it is not explained. And Rava continues, Hachi Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi, this is what Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi says, Hoelu pasach hakasa b'loshan nekeva, since the pasuk opens up in the feminine, it starts in the feminine, v'sayim b'loshan nekeva, and it finishes in the feminine, v'loshan zachar b'emsa, and then it has masculine in the middle, but tumas haguf hakosim medaber. That makes it clear that we're talking about tumas haguf. And Rashi explains, my mashma mikra de basrei to come up with tumas haguf. How do you know that from the later pasuk? That indicates that the earlier pasuk is by tumas haguf, when the person is tamei. Dilma basra b'tumas haguf. Maybe the later pasuk is by tumas haguf. Kidchsev, as it's written in the pasuk, nefesh asher tiga b'chol tamei. It says the person again. V'kamo b'tumas basra. Maybe the earlier pasuk is actually when the meat is tamei. Midelo ksiv tumasa aleha, because it doesn't say that tumasa aleha. That would indicate that we're talking again about the person. The mishtama nefesh asher tochal basar koi. Then already would be going on the person. It said asher tochal also in the feminine. V'chol masnisa delo mefarsha lo zeiri, and then Rava said any brisa not explained by zeiri l'kamei mefarish mai. The Gemara later will explain what that's referring to. In any case, the Gemara ends up saying that the proof is as follows: Ho'alu pasach hakosav hasheni b'loshen nekeva. Since the second pasuk starts in the feminine, v'sayim b'loshen nekeva, and ends in the feminine, v'loshen zachar b'yemsa, and then in the middle is the masculine. Techsiv, as it's written, nefesh kisiga b'chol tamei v'yochal mibsar zevach hashlamim v'nichras hanefesh. So again, it's clear kisiga is in the feminine, and then v'yochal is in the masculine, etc. It doesn't say achla, which would have been feminine. So therefore, once we see in that pasuk we're talking about tumas haguf, even though in the middle it talks in the masculine. Have a af harishon. So too when you look at the earlier pasuk, al tatame olav, don't be surprised in pasach v'sayim b'loshen nekeva. If that pasuk also it begins and ends b'loshen nekeva v'loshen zachar b'yemtza, and the masculine's in the middle. Afal pichein b'tumas haguf hakosim medaber. You can assume there also we're talking about tumas haguf. Umistabro hachi, and it makes sense that way. Shari b'tumas haguf haya osek v'holich, because in general the psukim over there are talking about tumas haguf. Uchvar pasak miladaber b'tumas basar. The the parsha already finished talking about Tumas Basar. Because the pasuk says, Tumas Basar. The pasuk already talks about the meat that is tamei. That's Tumas Basar. Basar kol Torah yochal Basar pasuk mi Tumas Basar. The pasuk then ends talking about Tumas Basar. Tumas Haguf, and now the new topic is Tumas Haguf. And that's where you have this pasuk v'nefesh asher tochal. And Rashi continues, umishum dehizkir akasav asa ochlo b'lashon nekeva. Since the pasuk mentions the one who's eating in lashon nekeva in the feminine, v'chasav v'tumaso olav b'lashon zachar, and then it says v'tumaso olav in the masculine. Hayinu sevurim shevetumas basar medaber achshav. We might think we're talking about Tumas Basar. Mikra hasheni yochiach, but now from the second pasuk we can prove she'afu b'lashon hazeh medaber. That's because that pasuk also it speaks in that language. Now v'ikasha, Rashi says, now if it's difficult to you, shnei krisos b'tumas haguf lama. Why do we have to have 2 times the pasuk telling us kares by Tumas Haguf? Actually, says Rashi, shalosh krisos. Actually, it mentions kares 3 times, but Tumas Haguf by Tumas Haguf. Well, the kamei meforish by pirkin l'mayit strichu, and the Gemara later will explain in this parak why they're all necessary. And Rashi continues, Masnisa de lo mefarish lo zeiri, a brisa that's not explained by zeiri, mahi, that what is it? Eza Mishnah, what Mishnah is going on? Lo pirish yafa, without zeiri's explanation, you don't have a good explanation. And the Gemara continues, Masnisa, again with regards to a brisa. The brisa should be explained by zeiri, otherwise it's not explained well. What's the example of that? The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, im nemru kalos, if it's stated the lenient ones, lama nemru chamuros, why are the strict ones stated? We'll see Rashi in a moment, and the Gemara further. Vim nemar chamuros, lama nemar kalos, and if it says the strict ones, why does it say the lenient ones? Im nemar kalos velo chamuros, and so the brisa says, if it just said the kalos, and not the chamuros, hayisi omer, then I would have said, al hakalos belav ve'al hachamuros b'misa. I would have said that on the lenient ones it's just a negative commandment, and on the strict ones there's a death penalty. Lakach nemar chamuros. That's why it says chamuros. V'im nemar chamuros, and if it only said by the strict, v'lo nemru kalos, and it didn't say by the lenient, hayisi omer, then I would have said al hachamuros yeh chayev, that one is liable by the strict, ve'al hakalos yeh potter, and by the lenient one is potter. This is all what I would have thought. Lakach nemar kalos, and it's for that reason that it says kalos. And so now the Gemara says, my kalos and my chamuros. What is this brisa talking about? What are the lenient ones and what are the strict ones? Elaim, if one will say that kalos, meiser, and chamuros truma, that kalos refers to meiser, again we'll see Rashi in a moment, and chamuros, the strict ones, refer to truma, so then the line in the brisa which says, hayisi omer b'misa, I would have said misa, hashtanami ha b'misa, actually it is b'misa. Hayisi omer sounds like I would have said misa, but that's not true. But that actually is true when it comes to truma. V'suin further, v'ilo nemar hayisi omer b'misa, and then it said if it didn't say it, I would have said b'misa. What does that mean? Dayo lovam and adin lios kanidon. Generally, when you make a kal v'chomer, you cannot go further from the source material. So what does that mean? That I would have said that? It sounds like you would have went further than the source material. You make a kal v'chomer from one case to the other. So we say that what is true by the kal is for sure true by the chomer, but we don't say that the chomer goes beyond the kal. And so therefore, again, that cannot be the explanation of the brisa. Ella rather, says the Gemara, kalos tumas sheretz. When the brisa mentions kalos, the lenient, that's talking about becoming tameh from a sheretz, from a creepy creature. And chamuros tumas meis. And by chamuros, when it says the strict ones, that's talking about tumah from a dead body. Now, uvamai. Now, what are we talking about? Ibit truma. If we're talking about truma, idi v'idi hubamisa, they're both a penalty of the death penalty. V'su lakach nemru chamuros devalav habamisi. And further, what does it mean that therefore we say chamuros, that it's a lav? It's not true. It's misa over there. V'iba achilas meiser. And if we're talking about the eating of meiser, and Rashi explains, Im nemru kalos le'inyan achilas kodshim betumas haguf shnuya b'toras kahanim. The context over here is, we're talking about eating kodshim, we're talking about eating something that is holy betumas haguf, when the person is tameh. L'kamei meforish v'yazal, my kalos, my chamurus, my hoyisi omer. As the Gemara goes on, it will explain what are the lenient, what's strict, what does it mean I would have said. And so again, the Gemara suggested, Inema kalos meiser chamuros truma. If you're going to suggest that what we're talking about is, again, a person is tameh, and let's say he eats meiser, that's the kalos, he eats truma, that's the chamurus. Shenemru shneim beparsha achas. Those are both stated in one parsha. V'lo yochal min hakadoshim kim rochatz besar b'mayim. That's the pasuk. He shouldn't eat from kadoshim. He shouldn't eat from the holy because he has to wash himself in water. He has to purify. V'ukimna le b'meiser b'meseches yevamis. In Meseches yevamis we say that pasuk is referring to eating meiser. Techsiv kim rochatz. It says that he should bathe. Hoyim rochatz yochal. That implies that if he does bathe, he could eat. V'afal bishalo herav shimsho. He can even eat even though the sun has not set. He's just what we call kol atvol yom. Harei tamei shachal meiser belav. And so you see over here, a tamei person eats meiser. That's a negative commandment. Uchsivu uvo hashemesh v'toher v'achar yochel min hakadoshim. Then it says that when the sun sets, he eats kodshim. V'ukimna b'truma. We say that part of the pasuk. They have to wait for sunset. That's talking about truma. Again, that first part is talking about meiser sheni, and this part is talking about truma. Uchsibahu in yona eitzel truma v'meisu bo ki. And it says by truma again that there's this death penalty. We're talking here about misa b'dei shamayim. V'kamar hatanim nemar meiser masha amar bo v'lo nemar truma. And so now the Tana of the Bryce is saying, if we said meiser, but we didn't say truma, hayisi omer b'misa, I would have said misa. Aval hashta denemru, but now that they're both stated, eino b'misa, it's not b'misa. But bitmiya, that's like a wonder. V'hamisa ksiva be, it is b'misa when it comes to truma. So that would be problematic to interpret the Bryce in this fashion. And Rashi continues, V'su and further, Imlo Namru, if it wouldn't have said it, Hayisi Omer b'misa bitmiya. It says, if it wouldn't have said it, I would have said b'misa. That also doesn't make sense. Mehecha teisi li b'misa. How would have I derived misa by truma if it wasn't stated? Halom Ma'isinan la'ela b'kal v'chomer mi meiser. The only way you could bring it is a kal v'chomer from meiser. But again, if meiser is the source and a kal v'chomer, you don't go beyond the source. V'dayu lovo min adin liyos kanidon. When you're using a din, when you're using this kind of a kal v'chomer, you can't go further from the source that you're bringing the kal v'chomer from. Ma meiser belav v'lo b'misa. So if meiser is a lav and not misa, av truma belav v'lo b'misa. So too truma would be a lav and not misa. So ella rather kalos v'chamuras to kamar. When we say lenient and strict in this brisa, a tumah kai, it must be going on a lenient kind of tumah and on a strict kind of tumah. And Rashi continues and explains the chsiv hasam because it's written over there tumas meis v'tumas sheretz. It's written about tumas meis and it's written about tumas sheretz. The chsiv because it's written v'anogea b'chol tamei nefesh oish asher yiga b'chol sheretz. We see tamei nefesh mentioned. We see sheretz mentioned. The chsiv b'tarvayu achilas meiser truma. It says by both of them the eating of meiser and truma v'yonshan and their punishment. V'ka'amar and the brisa means to say as follows: Im nemra tamei sheretz. If we mention tamei sheretz v'lo nemra tumas meis and not tumas meis uv'mai. Now, which eating? Eating, what are we talking about? V'aleza achila, what are we eating in tumas sheretz or tumas meis? So, ibet truma, now if we're talking about eating truma, al shteyan tumas hu ba'achilas truma b'misa, there is a death penalty of misa b'dei shamayim by both of them by truma, so that wouldn't make sense. Umayal akalos b'lav de katani, what would it even mean that on the lenient one, it would be a negative commandment? And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Dalid Amud Aleph.